Hello everyone, I'm going to take you through an edit on an image that I took out at Fort Griffin. It's not one that I took the night of our workshop, but it's a good example of what you can do with an image when you've got a good clear sky, you've got a good clear Milky Way, and if you happen to be out at Fort Griffin, you'll recognize this is that tree that we kind of referred to when we were up there, at least during the daylight hours. It's kind of famous. Most people that go up there to take Milky Way images at some point or another create an image with this tree in the foreground. If you look very closely in here, you can see the flagpole that's up there on the top of the overlook, and eventually I get rid of that. So I went through several steps, and I'm going to kind of walk you through each of them. Not sure I'm going to completely recreate the image because I have the ability to just simply through following the history of the changes show you how I took that. And I think having those histories, having that history visible to you as we go through will help you be able to kind of see what the impact is of each change as I go. Now, almost from the beginning, one of the things that I did with this was correct basically the distortion in it. And if we look over here under lens corrections, we can see there's a remove chromatic aberration. I mentioned that in our workshop. You're virtually always going to want to have this clicked. As a matter of fact, in my import settings, I usually import things with that in place. The enable profile correction, if I click this, you'll notice that the screen kind of stretches a little bit, and you'll also notice that it introduces a fair amount of brightness in the corners, and sometimes that's a really good thing. What I've seen, I prefer my Milky Way images anyway to have a bit of a vignette, and let's face it, if you're out there in the middle of the night, you don't see the night sky as being evenly lit in every direction. Typically what you see is a bright area where you're focused, and then everything kind of fades to dark around you. So to me, this is a little more realistic. The other thing about it is when you have this profile correction on, that brightness tends to exaggerate noise that takes place in the corners of the image. So I typically leave that off. Occasionally I will turn it back on, but I prefer it being off. So we're going to go over here to the next image in the set, and essentially this is the exact same image. If we look over here at my history, we will see that I imported it with chromatic and profile corrections turned on, evidently in this case. And what did I do? If I click right here on my history, what I'm going to do is see essentially how the image came in from my card, my camera card. So this is what it looked like, and I added some clarity. And we can see in the thing here, I added 76, it looks like. If I come over here to the basic panel, as I click through these over here, if you will notice on this panel, you will see the changes take place as well. So when you're reviewing the video and you see something over here, I click clarity. If you look over here, you'll see that it added 76. If I click back to where I imported, you can see the slider has returned to 0. So I added clarity, and I'm a big fan of clarity. You can see what it does. Look at the detail that came out here in the grass, in the tree a little bit. It brought up some of the light colors. It brought those up. And then I added dehaze. Now what does dehaze do? Dehaze eliminates some of the again, the haziness, the light fog look that you see sometimes in portions of an image. It also darkened it, took away some of the light that the clarity brought in. And then I added some vibrance, just add a little color and just see how that works, how it impacts it, how I feel about it. Not sure exactly yet, where I'm going to go with the image. I'm just going, well, what does it look like with a little additional color to it? And then I did the upright corrections, and that's through the transform menu. So I'm going to click on transform over here. Up here on the right is this little guided transform tool that you can use. And so basically what I did was I clicked on this and I brought it down, and I've showed you this before. But see the way this tree is leaning in, and I knew I wanted to try to straighten that up a little bit. So I took and I added an upright guide. Okay, so I just kind of follow the angle of that tree. Now over here, there's not one. But, so what do? I just create something. I just make it up. I go, okay, that's at about the same angle, the same distance off the side, roughly. Create one, and it will then apply it. It doesn't matter that there's nothing there, but it's going to apply that guide. I'm going to back out of this because notice that I started with this point and I added an upright guide, added another upright guide. All my history that I had after that from my previous edits has disappeared. And I want to bring that back because I want to go through what those edits were with you. So I'm going to use Control Z. And when I add Control Z, it takes me back a step. And then I did it again, and it takes me back another step. And now notice that I am back to the changes that I made before. So let's walk through those. So I had added the upright guides, and now you can see the guides going in. There we go, and that's what I got. And so then I went, okay, I'm going to crop this and get rid of these white areas where it's kind of straightened thing up. So I cropped from one side, then I cropped from the other side, and that's kind of what I was left with. And eventually I went all the way back to here. And I will explain to you why I did that. Basically, after cropping it into where I had before, I felt like I didn't have the composition I wanted. And so I decided what I was going to do was to take the image into Photoshop and use a feature called Content Aware Fill and use it to try to expand these horizon areas over here in these corners so that rather than having to crop the image to here, I could leave it a little wider. And so I'm going to take this over into Photoshop real quick. All right, so now I'm going to use a tool called Content Aware Fill, if you're not familiar with it. Basically, it's for filling in larger spaces in a image when you want it to just duplicate the area that's right around it. So in this case, I'm trying to gain a little ground over here, pardon the pun, to use so that when I crop this, I don't have to crop all the way to this point. I want to be able to crop further over and give me a little more space to work with for my final image for composition. So I just use the rectangular selection tool to get an area. Sometimes I use the lasso tool for irregular shapes, but for simplicity this time I use this. Also sometimes using it this way, especially if you're a little balanced in how you select, the results are a little better. So once you've selected the area you want to fill in, hit Shift F5 on the PC and you'll see it selected Content Aware, and there are other options there for filling in areas in your image, but we want Content Aware. Tell it OK. It'll do some calculations, and sometimes this is very quick, depends on how complex the area is, how many different options or objects there are. And in this case I got a really bad selection, and sometimes you may have to go back and hit Control Z, and we'll try that again, and let's see what it gives me, and see if it gives me the same or if it gives me a better option. And then on the other side of the image, I'm going to show you just another way to do it. That might be see now, you see the way that works. So I did it once and I got one result. I did it a second time, I got a different result. So those are something to keep in mind, is that when you get a result, you don't necessarily have to just accept that or say that it doesn't work. could try it again and see if it doesn't come back with a better option for you. Okay, so now that it's done that, I'm going to Control D and deselect that area, and then I'm going to want to go to my stamp tool, and normal, opacity 100%, flow 100%. My brush is at 300, my hardness is 0 because I want to try to blend this. And I'm going to come down here and just select an area. You can see the tree is kind of duplicated here, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to take and just select right here by holding down the Alt key, and then I can come over here and kind of line that horizon up so it's a little closer, and then I can paint in this area. And now Photoshop's catching up to me now a little bit here, but what that'll do is just as I'd said before, it's going to give me a little bit more room when I go to crop. There's some duplication in here. You can see these little things are duplicated there. Easy to get rid of. Just pick another spot. Let's just say right there where there's not one. Select that as your capture point, and then just slide over next to it and hit it again. You can see I've got some mottled look here, but we'll get rid of that in post, in Lightroom, and through a couple other things that we're going to do. Over on this side, rather than do the content aware fill, just your other option simply to use the stamp tool with all the settings kind of at the ones we have now with normal and 100% flow. Move your brush around until you can see it kind of lines up, and then just simply paint, and we'll catch up here. And again, the idea is just to get a little bit more ground to work with. Oops. All right, so that didn't work in terms of I went too far over. So I could Control Z and go back. One thing, a little lesson here, maybe a good tip, is that what I did was, again, held down Alt, selected the area I wanted to paint, and then I went over here, and once I got my horizon lined at where I wanted it to be, instead of making a bunch of little short strokes like this, stop, like this, stop, I held my key down on my mouse and I did the entire thing without break. And so what that means is when I go back and I do, if I have an error and I go in to do a Control Z, I've got to start all over, because what I've done now is just eliminated everything instead of just the last stroke that I did that created the issue, like that right there. So now if I Control Z, I've got rid of that. What I was looking at here was just this little bit. So you can see there's some artifacts and stuff, and we're gonna get rid of that. So then I will take and I will crop this down, knowing that I'm gonna have some more work to do over in Lightroom, but I'll crop it down to, and just cut out the main pieces there. Really trying to center that tree a little bit, which is good. And you can kind of see, if I had to crop before where that white deal came down, it would be further over and would push the Milky Way, in particular the core of it, right up against this right edge. So that's why I wanted to gain a little bit more space. And of course I always could have just left it the way it was without doing the straightening using the transform tool, but I like the trees to be straight, or as straight as possible. I like things to be vertical if they're supposed to be vertical. So we'll crop this, select that. I flattened the image. It was layer 0 and I flattened it. You can right click and one of the options is flatten image. If you've got a panel, control panel that you've subscribed to, you can flatten it. I've mentioned before, this is Tony Kuiper, K-U-Y-P-E-R. He's got some very advanced tools that you can use. Okay, I've flattened the image. I've gotten the area that I want, and we're going to go back into Lightroom. So I will file, save. That will take the image back into Lightroom. and we'll continue our edits there. Okay, here we are back in Lightroom, and what I've got up here is the image that I brought back from Photoshop into Lightroom. This is a slightly different version. This is the actual one that I had from the first time I did it. It looks slightly different than the last one I just showed you. You can notice this area is slightly different. This area is slightly different, but essentially the same process took place. What I've got over here is the history of the changes that I made, and we're just going to walk through each one of those rather than completely reprocess the image, and you can kind of see, what I've done to this particular image. So the first thing I did was add a little smoothing. Luminance is over here in the detail panel, and one of the things I want you to notice is, so for each step in this history, if I go back to bringing it in, you can see the luminance is 0. If I step forward one step, it can show you that I added 37 as the level in terms of the amount of luminance that I added. I then added dehaze. You can see that the image kind of got darker. It got rid of some of that cloudy look to it. And I added 22 on that. Dehaze resides in the basic panel here under clarity. So then I did black clipping, and you can see it shows up right here as a -25. If you recall from the previous session that we did on the bus, we talk about clipping, and these little arrows up here in the upper left and right of the histogram will show you, for example, right here, the blacks. Everything that's blue up here is essentially 100% black. Everything that's white up here, and if I click on that, you can see there's virtually nothing that's red. Maybe a couple of tiny little spots here on Mars. And so the next items that I did is I took white clipping up 15, and I could see what that did to the image, and to me it just wasn't enough. So I took it a little brighter, and now also you can see from the clipping, got a lot more little white spots, which is perfectly fine in this situation because you want the stars to be white. I'll turn that off so it's not distracting. I then added clarity, and what clarity does is add contrast in the midtones, and you can see the image just got a little more contrasty. This starts becoming a little grainier, a little grittier, a little more detail and texture in the grass and the trees, which is something I certainly wanted. Added some vibrance. I get a sense of what I can do by adding a little bit of color to it. Then I felt like temperature-wise it was a little blue. I wanted it to be a little more yellow. So I took my temperature slider up here to a +6. And then I added some more contrast, primarily looking to get that Milky Way to really kind of pop. At this point I was feeling like there was maybe a little too much green, so I added just a touch of magenta, +2, to try to lean the other direction a little bit. Add a little bit of vignette, and that's down here in the effects panel, post-crop vignetting, and took that to a -16. This is truly a personal preference. I think I may have mentioned already, if you think about standing outside in the dark, if I just go back a step and just say that's the way I want the image to be, my only issue with that really is that when you're standing outside, it's not bright all the way to the corners. Your vision naturally tails off and it becomes darker in almost a circular format around where it is you're looking. Maybe a little bit more of an oval, but either way, you've got some vignette. So I'll leave the vignette on there. Then I added a brush stroke. So what I'm going to do here, first off, I'm going to go back to the basic panel. Let's see if it'll catch up to me here. And click on the adjustment brush. Now, once you've used a brush on an image, you can always go back to it. And in this case, this is the brush that I added. So it's right here. I'm going to click on it, and that'll make it live. I've got the mask overlay indicated, and so you can see what I did with that brush right there. What's more, up here in this panel, we can see what the adjustments were for that brush. In this case, -35. So what I'm doing is trying to paint in areas of the Milky Way that I want to be a little more black. Again, trying to add contrast so that that Milky Way, in particular the core, has a bit more pop to it. And so each one of these brush strokes are me adding another little area of black into the image, and you can see they pop up, and I can tell the system already is moving a little slow, but you get the general idea of what I'm doing with each stroke is picking an area and saying I want to increase the darkness in that area. Okay, and now that that's there, if I click on Update Blacks Adjustment, you'll see that I took the darks even darker. I took it to a -57 over here on the brush, and that's just because I felt like I needed a little more punch in those areas. Now I add another brush stroke, and what I've done there, if we come back over here and I close this out and I open it back up, we're going to see a couple of things. One is we see a brush stroke here, that's the blacks. If you look right here, I've now got another brush stroke, and this is for whites or highlights in this case. So I wanted to increase the highlights. You can see there's just a little bit of red showing right here, which is where I made my first stroke. All of these brush strokes right here were done to color in the lighter areas of the Milky Way and brighten them up. And as you can see, the next adjustment I made, so you can see these are all areas that I painted in with highlights. And then I went over here, I'm at a 45 on my highlights on the brush, and I updated that, and I took it to 100. And then I felt like, you know what, I want even more, so I updated the whites on the brush and took that to 59. And if I close that brush out now, we'll see the impact was very subtle, even with the brush, because I had the flow set fairly low on that. I didn't want it to overpower everything. So I had the flow pretty low. I just wanted to add a bit more contrast. So after updating the whites, I thought the yellow was too distracting down here, so I used the yellow saturation shift in this panel here to bring down the yellows and the oranges a bit to kind of dim this out so it wasn't quite distracting. I'm going to skip over these adjustments right here. Basically, it was kind of an experimental brush stroke that I added. Instead, go to this one right here. And when I click on that, you can see immediately it brings up the tree, the highlights in the tree. The next few strokes are really just me adding texture, and by doing that, what I did was like took some of the highlights out of this area so that the tree doesn't look too flat. Once I feel like I have the tree kind of where I wanted it, you can see this brightened up a little bit when I just clicked on that brush. And then the next couple of brush strokes right here, I start trying to darken down these areas, because what I'm really wanting to do is bring the focus from being all across the image into more of this tree, Mars, and the Milky Way. So my temperature here, I click on that, you can see it warmed up again. I took it from a +6 to a +12, and then I went in and added some sharpening through the detail panel over here. So it's at 38 from what was a 25. Actually, it was 0 because it came out of Photoshop. You can kind of see the different brushes that I've applied. So this brush right here, if we look, I took it even darker, 0.77. If we click on this brush right here, I've warmed it up, added a little green to it. So I'm working on color tones in this area here, and then this brush right over here, you can see the areas that I've touched with that, and I took the highlights down. Again, try to make them as little distracting as possible. The other brush up here I've added, you can see this huge area everything but right around the Milky Way. And what I've done there is took the noise reduction up. I used the noise slider. If you take that to 100, it reduces the noise in these areas here. There's so much contrast and things going on in here that the noise kind of gets lost in the contrast areas. But in these wide open areas, this noise brush, it does help smooth out the image a little bit, make it a little less grainy. So then this convert to black and white, one of the things that I do in a image many times is take a look at it in black and white. I like black and white. To me, this is kind of an interesting image, actually. But it wasn't what I wanted to, started out for, so I'll take it back to color. And the way you do that, FYI, is up here in the, turn this brush off, up here in the basic panel, just black and white. Click there. There are presets over here with a variety of different types of preset options for converting. And I mean, like that looks fine. High contrast. So you can play around with these as you want. But for me, I said, no, I want it in color. Saturation. Notice here I desaturated it. So even though I didn't like the black and white, I did like it being toned down a little bit. I went in and adjusted the yellow saturation again. Up here, you can see I brought some of it back. I brought the blues up a little bit, and I brought the reds back up a little bit to try to bring out just a little bit of the color tone in here. And then I did another overall saturation adjustment. Decided I didn't like that tint and went into my tint over here, added some more magenta, went from a +2 to a +7, adjusted one more time the yellow saturation down, and then the blue as well, took that down a little bit. And that's the final image I wound up with. And my next step was to export it to the hard drive. Now, there's a lot of different changes in here. Why was that? Ultimately, it's because I had a vision for the image, what I wanted it to look like. And as I went in and I started processing it, I got to different points where I felt like, well, what if I took it this way? Or what if I took it that way? What if it was less saturated? What if it was more saturated? And I experiment as I go along, and ultimately I'll find something that I feel comfortable with. In this case, this is what I wound up exporting. Is it the perfect edit? Perhaps not. As a matter of fact, if I was really going to probably try to print this and sell it or something along those lines, I'd probably do some more tweaking to it, fine-tune it even more. If I was going to print it for myself, I might even go back to a look that was a little less saturated. Just depends on also where I was planning on putting it. And in the dark, let's face it, things aren't as colorful as they appear on this screen or on the back of your camera, for example. So hopefully this was helpful to you. I'm sorry if it's a little bit jittery in places. I kept having issues with my computer not wanting to record these steps at the same time as I was trying to illustrate them to you. But feel free to comment or email me if you have particular questions about this image, about the steps that I went through, if I left anything off that didn't make sense to you. And my hope is to continue to make videos like these, and I'll get better at it. And as you give me feedback on what would have been more helpful to you, I'll improve the presentation style and the materials so that eventually it becomes what you're looking for in order to help you improve your photography.